So, hi Emma, welcome to the Mom on the Spectrum community. I'm really honored. I was telling her before we started, I'm a fangirl of your work. I'm honored to have you here, and your resource, Workplace Adjustments for Executive Dysfunction, I feel like is one of the best available to our community right now. So thank you for being here to talk with us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you. I'm really glad that it's appreciated and it's helping a lot of people.
So if you are new to hearing about this, I for sure am going to have a link in the description so that you can access Emma's resource. She's made it available for free. Even if you're not employed, I feel like you should still read her resource because it has so much support for executive functioning challenges that so many people on the spectrum face. So today, Emma and I'm going to give her a chance to tell us a little bit about her resource that she's created. And then we had some questions sent in from the community through Instagram, through YouTube. So we're going to get to some of those, and I'm going to let Emma share her executive functioning genius with us on those questions. Emma, will you just tell us a little bit more about your background and kind of how you came to create this resource in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Emma Sharman. I live in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. So Canberra is Australia's capital. A lot of people have only heard of Sydney, but I am somebody who is late diagnosed as ADHD and autistic. So I only found out I have ADHD when I was 28, and then I was diagnosed as autistic when I was 29. So one of those things that a lot of people will be familiar with, where you kind of knew something was going on, but no one really had a word for it or could explain it to you until much later on. Late diagnosis really did change my life. Like, I understand so much about myself now that I didn't before being diagnosed. And the reason that I do sort of the advocacy work that I do is that I remember having to figure out a lot of things for myself and go online and find resources, like what Taylor does, and just, there weren't necessarily like, here's your packet of information about what you need to know now you've been diagnosed. And one of the biggest struggles that I had was with executive functioning. So being able to get things done, to initiate things, like organizing thoughts in my head. But like many people, when you get late diagnosed and you're sort of trying to find everything out about it, I did a lot of deep dives into learning about it. And I realized that the thing that would have helped me the most when I was diagnosed, because executive function was one of my biggest challenges, something that explained that to me and what was going on and some of the options that were potentially available to me to help with different elements of executive dysfunction, would have really been one of the first things that, like, I would have wanted to read. I found things out piece by piece over time. And so I put a resource together. And for me, I am somebody who does work full time. So while executive function issues like impact all parts of your life, at home and personal and your relationships, it impacted me the most in the workplace for a while. So I wrote a guide to what could be done to adjust things, account for things, help manage issues with executive dysfunction in the workplace. And that was what led me to write that resource.
Well, the first time I came across it, I think there's like a neurodivergent creator community I'm in on Facebook. And I can probably put a link to that in the description too, because I know there's a lot of creators out there who are looking for support. But I saw it posted, and, I come across a lot of things, and I saw that, and I opened it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is free. Like, oh my gosh, it's put together in a way, I feel like it's just made for our brains, like the way that you lay it out and the way that the information is presented. And I feel like this could easily be handed to like upper management to help them, implement some of these practices. Is that kind of part of how you created it, was so that it could be given to people who don't quite have the background to understand what's going on?
It's definitely like a starter point, like to get people thinking about it and understanding it when they don't have a background in it. And that could be somebody that is applying it to themselves, or it could be to somebody's, human resources unit or their manager. It can kind of be read from a number of different perspectives. I wrote it so that there were different things that, could be applied by an individual to help themselves, because I think that it's really important in those situations to kind of feel a sense of agency and the idea that you can actually have some impact on what's happening, but also things that in a workplace you might have needed a manager, supervisors, like support to actually put them into place. So things that could be done by an organization to support you. And so it needed to kind of cover a few different perspectives there that somebody might be reading it from. I have been told by other people that they find it useful in relation to schools as well. I don't think that there's necessarily like a limit to say that you have to use this in the workplace.
Right.
It was just the thing that I was most familiar with at that point, because I had been out of school for quite a bit
Right.
then. So
yeah, and I've actually recommended it, like when I've done one-on-ones with moms who are wanting support for their kids, and I'm like, look, I know this isn't for school, but this really, you know, does a great job of detailing the executive functioning needs of people on the spectrum. So yeah, I definitely agree that it can be used in different facets.
Yeah, no, as I think it gives people, like, as I said, like the starter point as well, because a lot of the time you understand what you're struggling with, but you don't have the words for it. Like that lack of diagnosis, if you don't know what specifically you're struggling with, you just know that maybe you feel like you're underperforming at work, or somebody is telling you you're underperforming at work, and you're like, okay, I can't achieve this, you know, standard that they've set out for me, but I don't know why. You know, it means you can have some words, like you can take the elements of executive function that I define in my guide, you can use that to go on and search and say, like, okay, I actually struggle with this particular element more so than the others. And you can find other resources online, but, you know, trying to search like, why doesn't my brain do thing?
Right.
You know, it's a little bit difficult to get started if you don't know what's going on.
Right, exactly. And I get that, you know, I get that a lot in the community too. And we've got some questions that kind of tie into this, but, you know, people want to know how to talk about this stuff, you know, through the lens of autism, because a lot of times there is this stereotype and this stigma attached with it that, you know, as soon as you tell your employer that you're autistic, that's going to come. Sometimes that's not the best approach, because they're going to have, you know, their own ideas about what that is and what that means. And so I think exactly what you're saying, like a lot of this can be described without using the word autism, which sometimes can be helpful depending on which environment you're in.
Yeah. In the start of my guide, I explained that executive functioning issues are something that a lot of people have. Essentially, everyone at some point or another
Right.
will struggle with
Yes.
executive functioning. Like, you don't need to be autistic, you don't need to have
Mhm.
ADHD, but it's about the extent and like how much of an impact it has on you
Mhm.
on a regular basis as well. And so, you know, the ADHD and autism are definitely reasons why people would have executive functioning issues, but there's also medications. They're, you know, undergoing cancer treatment, long COVID. Like, there's lots of different reasons why someone might have a problem, like that they're struggling with and trying to figure out what to do. And so it was one of the reasons why I labeled that it's for executive dysfunction, is that I
Mhm.
didn't want somebody to look at it and be like, well, I'm not autistic, I don't
Right.
have ADHD, I don't have depression, whatever it might be. I wanted someone to be like, I am having a problem getting this done, and I can use this. Because it's not like when you get a diagnosis that someone gives you a password and then you've got all these resources like immediately at your fingertips either.
That'd be nice.
um, but I wanted to make sure that that kind of barrier was removed, so that people could come in and be like, well, this is helping me. If it helps you, use it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm getting excited talking to you, because I'm like, well, we just have so much to talk about, because, you know, when I talk about neurodiversity in the workplace, that's what I try to tell employers too. Like, at some point, everybody's going to need some type of accommodation like this, even if they don't know how to ask for it. Like, we all deal with executive functioning difficulties. And so, and it's like you said, I've noticed this in the autistic community too. A lot of the things that we deal with, other people deal with too, but the intensity with which we experience it, and then the ripple effects it has on our life, and like how long it affects us, it's very different. So it can be hard to kind of explain that to people who don't understand it, but I do I just really resonate with what you're saying, that for us on the spectrum, there tends to be a different intensity and a different length of time that we're affected by these things.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move into some questions from the community. And this is just a generic one that I kind of summarized that was coming in from a lot of people. But what are some general executive functioning struggles that neurodivergent people tend to experience?
So, general executive functioning issues could include task inertia, not being able to get started with particular tasks, not being able to, transition between different tasks. It can be things like your emotional regulation. A lot of people don't realize that emotional regulation, so being emotionally overwhelmed, can be something that really stops you from being able to respond to anything else other than how you are feeling in that moment. So you actually have to work on maybe the stress you're experiencing or the sensory input that might be contributing to your state of mind before you can then do something else. It's such a varied thing that will happen because, of course, the spectrum of experiences, people will, some people, I'm very great at planning and putting a lot of things on paper, but then, perhaps the actual implementation and taking action, that is an area that is often a lot harder for me. So, sometimes I think that I'm a bit of an ideas gal as such. But then, that can mean that I jump from project to project or, thought to thought and don't actually stick with something long enough to actually get it going. So it will really depend on your own kind of profile about, like, some people will be like, well, I just struggle with everything. And that just might be the case. But for others, you may have a particular element of executive function that is like a bigger struggle for you than others.
Yeah, and what you're saying with ADHD, like autism and ADHD, I've joked on the channel before, like I will write out a to-do list that I'm so proud of, and I'm like, if I stick to this to-do list, like no problems, like everything's gonna be taken care of. And then as soon as I put down my pencil, it's like, I hate this list. Like I'm not gonna do anything.
It's more fun to plan it than to do it.
Definitely, definitely. Okay, so let's go to the next one. This is from Maddie Henry 6242. They said, how do you disclose a recent autism diagnosis after being employed somewhere for several years? Is it necessary to disclose, and how can I mitigate the risk of termination after disclosure? So that's a lot of questions, but generally, like, how do we deal with disclosing an autism diagnosis to an employer?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I'm going to go into here. I'll try and take them in sections so that you can sort of come back to the bit that's the most relevant to your situation. When it comes to, first of all, mitigating the risk of termination, I just want to acknowledge again, I'm from Australia, Taylor is coming from the US. One thing that is really important is to understand the disability protections in your area. And that is going to be on a federal and on a state or territory, in my case, level. There will be different legislations that are for disability discrimination protection. And so I believe in America, the Americans with a Disability Act is the federal level protection that you have available to you. But for example, I lived in California when I was a kid, and I believe that their one is FEHI, the Federal Employment and Housing Act, something along those lines. And so they have different protections in those two acts that apply to people that live in California. So this isn't something that you need a degree in order to figure out. Honestly, the best thing to start off with is disability discrimination protection, and put the name of the place that you live in so you can establish, what are my protections, what are my rights in this location. So I'm not going to say specifics because I don't want to say something that applies to me that
Right.
isn't going to apply to somebody's individual situation. But just do be aware that with regards to protections in a workplace, you're looking under disability in relation to autism, whether that is something you identify with as being
Right.
disabled or not. That is where you are looking for your rights to protection for discrimination in a workplace. When it comes to whether it is necessary to disclose, this is really going to depend on your individual situation. One thing that may happen is that for a lot of employment sort of rights when it comes to your protections. A lot of the time, those protections relate to having a specific diagnosis or having a specific disability that you can point to. What I would say is that there is generally not going to be a protection that is available to you under executive dysfunction. Like that, saying to an employer that I struggle with executive functioning issues, hopefully that they help you with that, but it's not going to be attached to anything specifically.
Right.
If you want adjustments put into place in your workplace, or adjustments in your workload, or things like that, they may be something that is accessible to you based on your employer just giving them to you, or there may be something that if it's not as supportive of an environment, or if they don't have as many resources, you may need to ask for them in relation to your diagnosis. So it is a bit of a choose your own adventure, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But these are the things to sort of keep in mind. When it comes to disclosing when you've been employed to somewhere for several years, look, this is something that I did go through. And when I got my late diagnosis, it was ADHD first, and then it was autism. I needed to go through a period of feeling comfortable with those diagnoses for myself.
Yes.
So I think that self-diagnosis is something that actually occurs for every single person, whether they're formally diagnosed or not, in understanding what does the diagnosis you've received actually mean for you, and taking on that understanding. And so I would not say that you shouldn't disclose immediately, but I think that it is important to go through the motions of having a level of comfort with your own diagnosis before you start to have that discussion, because you don't want your feelings about your diagnosis necessarily to be clouded by somebody else's perspective before you've had the chance to take it on for yourself.
Yes.
Get used to it. You may want to explore talking about it with your community, like with a partner, with a family member, with a friend, before you talk about it in the workplace, like, so you've kind of got that experience of what is it like. And you can also, even just start by saying, well, I'm learning some new things about myself, and I now understand that one of the struggles that I'm having with work is with organization and planning, or meeting deadlines, or I understand it relates to that. And you can say, I'm figuring that out, and I would appreciate some extra help with this while I'm working on that. You don't necessarily need to go to the full state of saying I'm autistic. This can be baby steps, and as you get comfortable with it, you can always choose to disclose further. A lot of the time, even when workplaces have really good policies or maybe culture around disability, neurodivergence, whatever it might be sort of caught under, sometimes it does depend on the individual manager that you're paired with about whether that is a safe environment for you to start having that discussion, and that's something to consider as well. I really wish it wasn't the case.
Right.
I wish it was just at a higher level and that things would follow. But we work with people from all different backgrounds and knowledge and education and perspectives. So those responses will be different person to person. About the only thing that I would say about a consideration that some people have had to make about whether they disclose that they're autistic publicly, in some sense, and when I say publicly, I do mean like in a workplace, like, if you're going to disclose your diagnosis, one thing that a little bit sad is that a few people who have children have had difficult family situations to navigate when it comes to custody arrangements. There have been instances where a diagnosis is used against someone in a custody arrangement. That's one thing that's not necessarily workplace related, but if it becomes a matter of a record somewhere, you may need to consider that. That's one thing that I would just say, it's not a nice thing to talk about, but it's better that people are aware of it.
Right. And there's so many great points. I'm trying to write down quickly over here. Stay up on track with you, because there's so many great things. I think absolutely what you're saying, and this is what I try to encourage people to do as well. First, you have to be comfortable yourself with your diagnosis and what that means for you, because for better or for worse, like you said, we work with all different kinds of people, and there might be a stigma attached to being autistic that this person doesn't understand. And I remind people, you know, as much as I think being autistic, sometimes you just can't get away from self-advocacy. I mean, that's part of being late diagnosed autistic, but it's not your job in the workplace to educate your boss or your employer on autism. It doesn't mean you can't. It's just use the way they respond as information. Okay, because I tell people, like, you don't have to be stuck in a job in a company that's not going to respect your diagnosis, that's not going to listen to you, that's going to be constantly invalidating. Because I think so many times in the autistic community, and I've worked one-on-one with somebody, it's like they want so badly, you know, to help people understand and to grow and to learn, but some people unfortunately just aren't open to that. And so I just try to remind people, you're there to do a job. And as much as you want to help other people understand autism, don't get caught up in feeling like that burden lies on you. Because there are places that are going to validate you and, you know, validate your experiences and create a workplace that is more accommodating to your needs.
Yeah, I would say that if you take that goal on for yourself of doing that education, it can be really disheartening if you run into the idea that there is somebody that there's nothing you can tell them, it won't change their perspective.
Yeah.
And it can be better to have a little bit of distance about that in a workplace, because if you ultimately at the end of the day need to show up and do your job so that you can earn money to survive in a capitalist society, sometimes there's things you don't want to discuss with people. Like, you don't want to learn their opinions and then have to continue to show up every day and work with them. You know, it can be a healthy thing to have an amount of distance, because there's only so much you can do to change their perspective.
Right. Yeah. And it's hard because I know a lot of us are people pleasers, and we want to do our best and like educate and inform, but you have to really monitor your energy and remember, like, there's only so much that one person can do. But yeah, I talked with my psychologist about insurance and disclosing a diagnosis. And this is something that people have asked me about too. So at least in America, if you get a professional autism diagnosis and you use insurance to cover that process, then the only people who get that information, the only people who know that you're autistic, are your insurance providers. Like, they have that information for coding purposes and, you know, to see which services are covered. But at least in America, there's no rule or requirement or law that says you have to disclose your autism diagnosis. At least this is what my psychologist was telling me. So I wanted to mention that. But yeah, I think the main thing here is I just tell people, like, use the way that your company or employer responds as empowering information. Okay, if they don't take it well, it's just information that you can use to start planning where you can go next, you know, to find more support. And we'll get to that later, because there is a question about, you know, how to find a job that helps you. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, so the next question is from Imogen Oliver, and they said, this one's interesting, and I was glad that you said you were open to talking about this. Another one is how to deal with uneven sensory input you can't leave the room to get away from. For example, medicine is a huge special interest of mine. I want to get into the field one day as a surgeon, but can't just leave the operating room when the lights or sounds become too much. So how do we deal with sensory input that we can't get away from?
Yeah, no, and it's a really good question from Imogen. Basically, I think, first of all, like, it's really good that you're thinking ahead about the sensory environment that you're going to be in. So, like, having that knowledge and understanding before you get there as much as possible. Sometimes it's, you know, you're in a situation and then you sort of deal with it on the spot. But if you are aware of what you're sort of facing before you go in there, that's one of the first things to actually know. So, you know, in that surgical environment, in that operating theater, you know, what kind of like materials, like clothing that you might be required to wear, the lighting, the sounds, the sensations that you're dealing with. Having a stock of that to sort of keep into account will, first of all, make you think of things that you could prepare beforehand. It can be obviously limited, especially in a surgical environment, about what you're able to take in there. But even, you know, like the clothes that you're wearing underneath the scrubs and all of that kind of thing, taking into account your sensory needs as much as possible before you get into that room, so that anything that you do have control of, as much as possible, you are going to be looking at ways to reduce the impact of what you can control. And what I would do is I would then extend this, like the before and after. You want to be going into that environment ideally with the most amount of spoons, the most capacity that you have, and you want the most capacity to recover when you leave it. So thinking about what is going to help me be in the best space that I can be before I go into that room. So, maybe not having, as much as possible, not having stressful conversations that might mean that you're in a heightened emotional state, or not dealing with loud noises, maybe using noise cancelling headphones if noise input is the thing for you beforehand. Essentially, looking at ways that means that you're sort of, in a steady kind of state before you know that you're going somewhere that is actually going to sort of increase the sort of sensory burden on yourself. And then similarly, as much as, again, you can influence it, trying to find, is there a quiet room that you can retreat to? Is there a weighted blanket or some other, fabric sensory comfort that you can access as you leave, to essentially try and help regulate the state that you're in before and afterwards as much as possible. Adjustments that can be made in the room, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, like especially, again, with that operating environment, you're going to have to deal with a lot of the regulations that are in place there, but you can definitely talk to your employee about whether there is anything that can be adjusted for you in that space, and just see if you can work with them to the best of your ability to impact that. And I think that for me, I've had to face moments where I'm like, I am about to go and deal with this sensory input that is really tough and takes its toll on me, but knowing beforehand is still much better than just being exposed to it and having to respond on the spot.
Yeah, and it's, again, just so well said, and I agree with so much of what you're saying. And I think, especially in the field of medicine, since we're taking this as our example, just paying attention to the things that really feel good to you. Like, I like being in this environment. I like learning about this. There's so many different ways to study medicine. There's so many different types of surgery. So, just like what Emma's saying, if you're going to be in surgery on Fridays, I was thinking about spoon theory while you're talking. And if you're unfamiliar with spoon theory, it's basically this idea that every day we have a certain amount of spoons that represents the amount of energy and resources we have to give that day. And if you have surgery, that might use all 20 of your spoons. But if you know that you're going to be in surgery on Friday and all your spoons are going to be gone, you can make choices on Thursday to help you store up more, like extra spoons for Friday, right? So that would be resting more, staying hydrated, making sure you're eating well, that type of thing. So if you're interested in spoon theory, I can put a link to that.
Yeah, it's by Christine Miserandino, and she's got really good resources on her website and things. So they're including visuals if you prefer to learn visually. So I know that there's also lots of a few versions of spoon theory. So for the nerds out there who, I say that identifying as a nerd myself, not as an insult, who like Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop role-playing games and stuff. Some people think of it as spell slots. You've got a certain amount of spell slots before you have to rest, and then you have spell slots available again. So there's a few fun little bits of flavor text that are out there.
I love that. I wanted to just encourage people that I think that there is a lot of hope in terms of building your capacity for things. So I think Orion has talked about this on his channel with parenting. I'm a parent. I've got 2 kids. They're 6 and 9. And like, you can't not do some things, like sometimes they're sick and you have to change the bed sheets and, whatever, and you just find a way through. And, over the years, I can look back and think, okay, my capacity has definitely increased. It's definitely grown. And I think in the moment, as those stressful things are happening, we try to overcomplicate things and think, I need this magic recipe for sensory regulation. A lot of times it's just as simple as coming back to your breath, just taking a really deep inhale and doing kind of a body scan. Where am I holding tension? huge exhale and just release as much of that tension as you can. That's one of the most regulating things that you can do. And something as a parent that I find myself doing a lot when I am in a situation that I'm like, this feels a little bit beyond what I can handle right now. I just try to check in with my breath. And gradually over time, I've noticed a considerable increase in my capacity for what I can tolerate. Okay, so let's go to our next question here. Do you feel like this question, I would love to know the best approach to requesting some of these accommodations without a formal diagnosis. Do you feel like we kind of covered that?
Yeah, a little bit, but just to reiterate, just talking about your needs, you don't necessarily have to disclose that they relate to a particular diagnosis. So talking about this is the way that I can be supported to do my best in a working environment. And a good employer, I know that that's a range of people, but a good employer, they should want to support you, but you're talking to them about how you can perform your best. Like they generally want you to perform your best for them and be coming up with the best results. So talking to them about like if this is provided to me, if I can have this kind of support, then I can bring my best self and my best performance to a workspace. That should be something that every employer wants, for selfish reasons or otherwise.
Yeah.
So I think maybe framing it as that as, look, I want to achieve to this high level or to this standard. I would like some assistance with this thing that is a bit harder for me in order to do that.
Okay, so on that topic too, I know that, when researching autistic accommodations in the workplace, and a lot of the ones that you've listed in your guide, a majority of them are free. Like they do not cost anything to implement so many of the things that make our job easier. And so, like you said, employers selfishly or for whatever reason, like they should want to help support you be the best version of yourself in the workplace as possible. And many of these accommodations come at no cost. So it's at least worth a conversation. And again, how they respond, use it as information as you consider making career choices. But yeah, just an encouragement that most of the things that we're asking for are very small in comparison to what other workplace accommodations could be. I don't know. Do you agree with that? Do you feel like most of the accommodations don't cost much?
I deliberately put things in there that would not necessarily, like there are sections that are talking about, assistive technology. That's more where there's likely to be costs and things. And there's something that can be considered. One thing, like one of the reasons why I made sure I included things that had a cost to an employer and things that did not is, one, there's a lot of employers who will not want a cost. But on the other end of things, there are actually some employers who specifically want to say, well, this is what we spent on disability and on diversity and inclusion. We want some actual hard figures behind it. So there are some people that, maybe that's more in relation to government, it's very possible, but there are some organizations out there that want to have a one and done. Here, we've purchased you this software, we've done done this, for better or for worse. But I think, there are a lot of things that can be implemented at an individual manager to employee kind of level, just in the way that they work with you. As simple as like if somebody's requesting that you perform a particular action, that they should put that deadline to you in writing so that you understand the priority it has. Like that doesn't actually cost them. That's just getting, and it should be maybe something that more people should just do in general. But one of the things that we can struggle with is prioritizing and what things need to be done first. And sometimes that's not something that's spoken to deliberately because people assume you will understand that this task is a priority because of the nature of the task. That's not really how my brain necessarily works, because often I'm like, actually, this is the thing I'm interested in at the moment, and this is the thing that I want to do, regardless of whether it's a priority or not. So somebody deliberately saying, we are now working on this task and it needs to be done by X time, is really quite an important thing. And it's literally, maybe an extra sentence, maybe just a date. It's not like something that's going to be, all right, I'm now going to have to charge the organization $40 for this particular, thing. So they should, I very much want adjustments to not just be things that you have to pay for in order to get access to them.
Yeah, and they can just be mindset shifts like that, like how we approach the planning and everything. But one accommodation that I saw at a company that I got to speak at recently, they made a rule. And let me pause and say, like, a lot of times when there's something on the calendar for us, it can be kind of hard. Like, you know, if I have a dentist appointment, that's the only thing I'm thinking about. And like, I feel like my whole day is shot until, you know, then after my dentist appointment is over, I feel like I'm recovering from the dentist appointment, right? So it's like when we have something on the calendar, it can be kind of hard to deal with that. And so at this one company, one of the accommodations they made is that when you schedule a meeting, it has to clearly list who's in the meeting, what the purpose of the meeting is, what specific questions are going to be addressed at the meeting, and how long the time, how much time is allotted for the meeting. And if you don't provide that information, then you don't have to show up at the meeting. I thought that was a pretty great approach.
Wow, yeah, no, definitely. There's a lot of times where there are meetings in your calendar that are like, this meeting could have been an email, or this meeting is not actually relevant. I can't contribute to this particular meeting. Not all the time. Some working meetings do really help, but I think having a very clear intent behind a meeting like that would really add value, honestly.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where I feel like, okay, this is going to benefit the whole company. This is going to benefit everyone, because if we plan out what this meeting is going to be and how it's going to look and how it's going to run, it's going to run more efficiently. We're going to have questions prepared. We're going to have resources prepared that we can hand out. So this is one of those things I'm like, this should be a no-brainer. Let's try to help support each other in the way we plan things out.
100%, definitely.
So I've got one more question here. We've been able to answer a lot today, but I get a lot of questions about this. This one specifically is from Dana Marie S. And they said they're looking for advice for finding the right job or career when it comes to being supported with executive functioning challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something a lot of people have questions about. You know, one of the things that I would say is there are some options online that you can sort of engage with, getting an idea of some companies have reviews for what their diversity and inclusion kind of performance is like. You know, we even have, you know, specific organizations in Australia that actually go in and do reviews of companies and provide, you know, performance when it comes to their diversity and inclusion work, like how are they actually doing. And that's not the be all and end all, but it is a good option to sort of even just see if there is something online about the company that you're looking at where somebody, you know, has said that either they left, or that they, you know, they found it really supportive, or do they have here they tend to be called like diversity and inclusion networks at this point in time. You know, do they have actual support structures set up that are sort of designed to support people with different needs, different backgrounds? So that can be something that you can look at, whether a company is actually specifically putting publicly about, like on their public profile information, you know, is this something that is a goal of theirs? That can be a starter point to see if there's something that you can expect in terms of support when you get there. But I think for autistic people specifically, one thing that needs to happen is understanding what your needs are, especially from a sensory level, but in terms of your workplace environment, what is it that you need, and looking for a job that will provide that environment rather than just applying for a job.
Yes.
So for me, in the last couple of years, I've been able to do a hybrid working arrangement where I work some days from the office and I work some days from home. That's works really well for me. It won't work for everyone, but I would not apply for a job going forward that said that I had to be in the office 5 days a week, because that is not going to support my needs for regulation. And, you know, maybe even, you know, that you function better at different times of day. If it takes a bit longer in the day for you to really kick into gear, and if you're like, my brain scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock in the morning, then if there is a company that you're like, this is a great job, but it is mandatory for me to start at 7 a.m., don't interview with that company.
Right.
So really, I think a lot of people will have an attachment, maybe, like there's a lot of chance that people will look for things that maybe relate to their special interests, because that will keep their engagement. But I would say don't do that in face of an environment that you know won't work for you. It might be something where you're like, I really want to work in this field of academia or something like that, like, or this is my particular interest, or I really want to work with this kind of animal, but the location means that you have to get up a couple extra hours early just to get there, and that's not really going to allow you to have the time to do the emotional regulation you need in the morning before you go in. One other thing that you could do is you could see if there is any kind of exposure that you can get to what it's like at that particular company. Not necessarily advocating for like internships as such or anything like that, but is there any way that you can experience what a place is like before you get there? Even just there are places that will let you go in for a trial day, see what the environment is like, as much as possible, understanding what you can kind of expect when you get there, and not having a completely blank slate be your expectation, because it means that you kind of are then put in this position where whatever they shape as their environment, you kind of just have to respond to.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have as much influence over it before you get there, or ask for different things, or decide, well, this isn't for me. You don't want to have committed and said, yes, I'll sign up for this job with kind of absolutely no understanding of what you're going to face when you get there, because it's much harder to reactively shape your environment than it is to start to influence it before you get there, or start to make decisions about it before you get there.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of us who think, well, I don't even know what I need or what accommodations. So I would advise people who feel that way, look through Emma's guide and just make a note of the things that stand out to you. Like, oh, it'd be so nice to have this support. It would be so nice to have this accommodation. Literally make a list, because really, honestly, the things we focus on, we create more of. And so if we know what we want, like Emma's saying, it's like, if we go into the job search knowing this is important to us, we can be looking for those things, asking those questions, coming prepared into interviews, and knowing what it's going to take in order for us to feel supported. I'll put a link to my Big Autistic Resource Guide in the description, because there's several websites, and there's more becoming available, of companies who are specifically looking for neurodivergent minds to add to their businesses. So I'll put a link to that in the description. I'm always updating that. The other thing I was going to say is that there was a particular time in my life when I was just so completely burnt out emotionally, that I took a job at a cupcake bakery. And to this day, it's like one of the most fun times I've ever had. It was this rote, the same thing over and over again. I made the same recipe every day. I scooped the same number of cupcakes every day. I did the same toppings every day. It was one of the most healing chapters of my life. And no, I didn't make a ton of money, but it was so good for my soul. It was so good for my nervous system to have something that was predictable, that I knew exactly what was happening. So I also want to encourage you, if you find yourself in a place of burnout, it's okay, for a season of life to do something that's maybe not your calling, maybe not, what you went to school for, but maybe just like a job where you know what to expect. It was really good for my nervous system. And I know, since having talked to others in the same situation, that sometimes that can be a really helpful thing to do.
Yeah. I would add to, like, when you don't know what kind of workplace adjustments that you might need, as much as it can be a little bit difficult in terms of emotional regulation, thinking about times when you have struggled in a workplace environment or your personal relationships. Look, a lot of autistic people, we generally receive a lot of feedback about the things that we do wrong. I'm going to say, like, look, I think you could assume that a lot of people have encountered that. So thinking back to some of those things and thinking, is there a common trend? Like, are people saying that, look, you just don't plan stuff far enough in advance for it to actually work out? I'm not receiving enough notice about this, or something like that. Or if you've received feedback from managers, is there enough similarity there to kind of identify, well, this is an issue that I struggle with? And then to turn that on its head, what could those people have done in those situations to actually support you, to help you with those things? Like, one of the things that's most frustrating about when we get feedback is just, well, you have failed at this thing. And it's like, okay, but we're talking about a situation, there's always two people in a situation. What could they have done to make that situation accessible to you? What support could have been provided? You know, extra reminders that something is on, or, you know, if there's an event that's coming up, like maybe rather than just the fact that there's an event on, putting a calendar notice in that's like planning for that event 2 weeks prior to when it's actually happening. What kind of proactive things could be done when you have these situations in mind? And they are not necessarily just things that you can do. Like, it's okay to expect an amount of people coming to the table, people providing, you know, support, it being a partnership. You know, there are things that can be made better about a situation by both parties contributing, and there are things that can be made worse about a situation by both parties contributing. So thinking about it, because I think a lot of the time the onus is placed on us to be different, and it's like, well, actually, is it actually something that was just us, or is there another element to it that should always be considered, so that there can be accountability on both sides? You know, what can you bring to a situation to make it better, but what can they do as well?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation here, and something I try to remind the community of so often is our experience matters just as much as the other person's. And we deserve to be accommodated. We deserve to be able to work in our fullest expression of ourselves. We deserve to have fulfilling, satisfying work. And we don't have to make ourselves smaller or sacrifice our comfort in order to do so. I mean, yes, sometimes we're all going to sacrifice in small ways, but generally speaking, on a large scale, we really deserve to take up space, to use our voices to get our needs met. And so I'm here. I know Emma's here. Like, we're just supporting the community. Like, use your voice, speak up for what you need. We're here to help you, but you deserve it. And I believe, I know the workplace is strengthened whenever we can work at our full capacity and bring our unique skill set and our unique brains into the picture. I would just really think it's very transformative for the companies, for the world. We need to be heard. It's very important.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. Well, this has been so wonderful. I feel like you and I could just have a very long conversation about lots of things. But do you have any other resources that you'd like to promote? Or I want to know, is there a way that we can donate to the work that you're doing? This is a very generous community. So how can we support the work that you're doing?
Look, I have my website. It's www.neurodivergentemabler.com, where other resources and things that I've put on there. I'm mostly on Facebook at this point in time, but anytime that I do add more resources that I have been putting together, like, they will be linked from my website to make it easy for people to download them from one spot. I'd say at this point, I'm just happy for my resource to be shared to help as many people as possible, because I knew what having something like that would have been like for me at the point that I was diagnosed, how much it would have sped up the process of understanding some of the struggles I was going through, and just ultimately myself. And so if you find value in it, please just share it on so it can continue to do that work in the community.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate your generosity and all the work that you do for the community. So I'm going to put all of Emma's resources and links in the description. She had mentioned that she might be willing to answer a few more questions. If you want to put them in the comments here, if you want to reach out to her via Instagram or Facebook, she might be able to respond to some other things that we didn't get to. Again, always, like we say in the community, like, we get to those things when we have the capacity to do so. But I know that Emma's heart is to be able to reach out and respond back with support for other people whose questions we didn't get to today. All right. Well, thank you so much, Emma, and just best of luck to you and your endeavors and your new mom life. And we just wish you the best.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's been really good to be here today.
Thank you.